All right, I think we're live.
All right.
Amazing. Hello, everyone, friends, folks, and family. Welcome back to another episode of the Global Youth Climate Training Program. We're super happy to be here. I'm Jen from the Global Youth Coalition, and I'm here with Kenta.
Hi, this is Kenta. I'm from the Oxford side, helping out with the GYCT program. Really looking forward to today's program.
Amazing. So today we're gonna talk about a topic that is super important. Um, it's the title is called "Show Me the Money." So we expect to find the money in this session, and see how we can finance a green transition. Today, specifically, we're gonna be looking at what is the global landscape of financial flows right now for the energy sector and in general, and what should financial institutions commit when there comes to financial flows. Remembering that there's this article in the Paris Agreement, in the 2.1c, that means that financial flows should flow into low carbon and climate resilient development. So we want to understand what does this mean for the energy transition. And regarding access, we want to know what can non-state actors, what are they doing, and how can we ensure a high ambition on the new collective quantified goal, and how does this financial commitment look like? So now, Kenta, next slide, please. Maybe we can go through the housekeeping rules. Um, yeah, go for the agenda and then.
Yeah, so we have quite a few speakers today. Um, we have Valerio, Omar, Adriana, and the three of them will be giving you a lecture on the topic. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session. And yeah, we'll just wrap up with a few final reflections. As usual, please do put your questions in the Q&A or raise your hand at the Q&A period. And I will be pasting the links to our groups on LinkedIn, Slack, and community note taking. So if you would like to collaborate on the community note taking, please follow the link that I copy and paste now. Yeah, I think that's housekeeping from my side. Oh, yes, we will give you a little bit of information at the very end regarding some other stuff as well. But yeah, I think without further ado, we would like to invite our first speaker, Valerio, and I will introduce him. He is an associate director at Climate Policy Initiative. And over the years, his work has focused on the effectiveness of climate policies, financial innovation, Paris Agreement, and the net zero transition. This last work led to the launch of the Net Zero Finance Tracker, which is a tool that tracks the alignment efforts of financial institutions, primarily in the private sector. Before joining CPI, Valerio was a researcher on sustainable consumption and production at Bocconi University. And prior to that, he worked in Zurich on risk modeling for carbon funds and carbon origination. Um, yeah, so without further ado, the floor is yours, Valerio.
Thank you very much again, and Kenta. Let me see if I can control the slide deck from here. Like if you can share it, and then I will move it around. Okay, thanks. So
How's that look?
yeah, that looks great. Okay, so maybe you can move to the next slide, and also you can give me the control if you want. So for those who don't know CPI, let me start from there. We are an analysis and advisory organization with deep expertise on finance and policy. Our mission is to support governments, businesses, and financial institutions in driving economic growth while addressing climate change. And our team is based around the world in Brazil, India, Indonesia, the UK, and the US, and with a new office just launched in South Africa. We are an independent non-for-profit organization and have been supported by a diverse range of funders, principally government agencies, foundations, and financial institutions, as well as private actors, and work with public and private sector partners from both developed and emerging economies. We are known for tracking sustainable investment trends, identifying innovative business models, and supporting the solutions that can drive a transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy. Specifically, starting from the left, tracking and mapping started in 2010 with the first assessment of global climate finance flows ever undertaken. And over the years, we also contributed to the development of analytical methodologies that supported the various clients assess the alignment of effectiveness of climate finance investments. And then finally, CPI is involved in the design and development of innovative climate finance policies, financial instruments, and the business models to scale up investment and measure its impact. Today, what I will do, I will first introduce the scale of the challenge on the decarbonization, presenting results from the global landscape of climate finance. I will then focus on mitigation and energy transition to conclude on the role of the private financial institutions in delivering a net zero finance transition. So starting from the scale of the challenge and with the good news, the analysis of trend.
Valerio, just sorry, one thing. One of the comments, could you speak a little bit slower, please?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. Analysis of the trends we observed say that the average annual climate finance flows reached almost $1.3 trillion most recently, which means it nearly doubled compared to 4 years ago. This large increase was primarily driven by a significant acceleration in mitigation finance, which went up $450 billion. And the remainder of the growth observed stems from methodological improvements and the new data sources, resulting in additional finance flows above the dotted line that you can see in the right side of the graph. That's very important because you can regulate or control what you cannot measure to begin with. Now, increase of finance is great news. However, there is still a significant gap between the current flows and what is needed for a low carbon and climate resilient development. This graph here depicts a reality check of where we should be headed, and at least $6 trillion in annual investment is required by 2030, according to publicly available estimates. And this amount is expected to climb to around 10 trillion per year until 2050. So the challenge is then significant, but is it impossible, at least on a quantitative basis? The slides here suggests not 1.3 trillion in climate investment is about 1% of global GDP. In 2022, public sector alone spent twice as much into military. We spend over $1 trillion every year in direct subsidies to fossil fuel, which becomes 7 trillion when implicit subsidies are also counted. The question is then how to mobilize the trillions in climate investment. And the high-level answer is that we will need to have all public and private actors to align finances with Paris goals. But what does it mean? It means joint efforts from governments and financing institutions, and seizing what in the end is an opportunity to invest in the transition towards a low carbon economy. Important is, of course, to clarify that this will be different in various contexts. There are various decarbonization trajectories different countries choose, and depending on resources and sectors. So what happens when we focus on mitigation and energy? As we can see from this graph, mitigation continues to attract almost all climate finance, receiving, in fact, more than 90% of the total climate finance, and leaving adaptation and dual benefits project far behind. Mitigation projects in the energy and transport sector alone were responsible of 2/3 of the total climate finance flows in 2022. Mitigation also seems to be attracting virtually all climate finance coming from the private sector, which is the orange color in the graph, while adaptation remains a prerogative of the public sector. Specifically, we can see that in 2022, annual mitigation finance has been growing 60% compared to the previous 2 years, which is an all-time high for mitigation, and one that really drove the major increase we presented earlier on the total climate finance flows. Growth has not been consistent across mitigation sectors. The energy and transport sector continue to attract the majority of mitigation flows, with energy receiving 44% of the total, as you can see here on the left. And within the energy sector, renewable energy attracted almost all the financing, with solar PV and wind leading. These two markets have been massively growing, driven by lower technology costs and strong policy support across the world. Although mitigation efforts attract most of the climate finance, the investment gap to avoid the worst impact in climate change still remains quite huge. And this chart compares mitigation finance flows in green with the mitigation finance needs in yellow and mitigation potential on the secondary axis. What we see is that while mitigation finance reached 1.2 trillion, the annual flows actually need to increase by a factor of 7 between now and 2030. And if we look at the sector breakdown, the largest investment gaps in absolute terms are observed once again in the transport and energy sector. So energy is at the core of the transition. Transitioning the energy sector is not just a challenge of increased clean energy, but much more needs to be done in the sector to shift policy support and capital away from fossil fuels. So first of all, we need a decrease in investment in fossil fuel capacity. A study we did more than a couple of years ago now already revealed that no new capacity of fossil fuel is aligned theoretically with Paris goals without anticipated retirement of fossil fuel capacity elsewhere. Any level of investment in fossil fuel brings energy investment trajectory towards misaligned pathways at both global and the local level. And as you can see from the graphs, among private investors, commercial banks were the most misaligned sources of fossil fuel financing, mostly towards natural gas. Misalignment about public actors was instead most severe for export credit agencies responsible for large-scale coal financing, driving extreme misalignment when aggregated by technology or by region. And investment trends in the export credit agencies in fossil fuel are still confirmed today. Second aspect to consider for the energy transition is that it is not an easy task. Obviously, in another work we did, we looked into the energy transition vulnerability of key mineral-rich states in India. These are also the states that are most economically impoverished, with limited additional economic drivers. We broke down climate risk vulnerability in 5 dimensions: fiscal and economic, physical climate risk, socioeconomic, diversification options, and political economy. And from a political and social point of view, we can see from this graph the transition is particularly problematic for those states with significant share of revenues from power generation and coal mining, which also have significant share of populations involved in the industry and limited options for diversification, like the Chhattisgarh state, which is the first column on the left of this table. So initiating a discussion on just transition pathways is also vital for energy transition, and transition assistance finance will be needed to assist vulnerable states.
Valerio, sorry to cut you off again. Could you please slow down because of the interpreters? Yeah, I think, yeah, that'll be great. Thank you so much.
Right. The third aspect to consider for the energy transition is that we need a private sector. Going back to the clean energy finance gap, when we look at public and private finance sources in more detail, we can see that the overall share of tracked climate finance provided by public sources is now slightly more than half of the total. So mobilizing private finance scale is really important in the years ahead, given limited public budget. So we need to get private finance on board. So how can we further scale up private investment, and what is the role of financial institutions, and how we can investigate this over time? So to answer to this question, a couple of years ago, we started to work on a collaborative data knowledge and advisory platform called the Net Zero Finance Tracker to assess how private finance institutions are progressing in their net zero goals by harmonizing data. The goal of this work was to support an accelerated transition, providing the robust, transparent data for the financial sector to feed a better informed policymakers and advocacy decisions. So I'll give you a little bit of background on this before jumping into the conclusions. So we track 3 dimensions in the tracker, which are proxies about how entities are responding to Paris Challenge from the intention set through targets to their implementation, translation the targets into implementation actions, until the final allocation of capital in the real economy, which is the impacts. Each dimension is assessed by a set of underlying indicators, for example, adoption of mitigation targets, disclosure of climate risks, project level clean energy financing across the 3 dimensions that we map. The indicators under targets and implementation are usually assessed qualitatively. We build a scale, which we define here as budgets, which tells how strong is the response of financial institutions, whether they are at the initial stage, or they're still planning, or whether they are providing a fully aligned response for the indicator assessed. While for the impact side, we measure progress quantitatively, benchmarking where possible against available quantitative benchmarks, although those are not yet in part, in many cases, still under development. As mentioned, we pull all the data from a variety of data sources. We standardize it and we assess it, and then we benchmark it. And at the moment, the tracker includes around hundreds of data sets from 50 data providers, including CDP and PRI and Influence Map and many others. So after having taken my time to introduce the dashboard, so what do we observe in it? And when we look into the response of financial institutions. So our analysis was based on a sample that focuses on institutions that are part of net zero coalitions under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. So it is a proactive subset of the financial system. It does not represent the entire financial system, even though we plan to cover it in the future. So what we observed, most of the progress has occurred in the adoption and in the quality of climate mitigation targets, but also in the adoption of operational targets related to climate investment, like climate investment goals and fossil fuel phase out and exclusion policies. So looking more in detail, starting with a graph on the right, almost 3/4 of financial institutions in our sample, which represent almost all assets in the sample, had set mitigation targets by 2023. The share of entities that have achieved quality mitigation targets, which are signed with a partial response in the graph on the right, now reaches 40% of the institutions. And the level of coverage of portfolios interest has also been improving over the time. And now 10% of institutions with a target cover more than 90% of the investment portfolios. This is good news, considering that we're still in the absence of finalized guidances on mitigation goals for financial institutions at the moment. Moving to the climate investment goals, which is the second bar in the graph on the right, we can see that only a few entities have quantified goals, but those are the largest entities, and the climate finance targets have grown significantly to at least 14 trillion in cumulated climate investment commitments, as shown in the graph on the left. There was also a slight increase in the adoption of fossil fuel phase out and exclusion policies. Here is important to know that most of the literature recommends fossil fuel phase out to be the leading strategy to be adopted to increase the impact in the real economy. However, most of the financial institutions have committed so far to divestment or partial fossil fuel exclusion, with only 2% of entities found to have phase out exclusion policies so far. So how do the institution then follow on their goals? What actions are they implementing? So here progress has been mainly driven by disclosure of emissions and climate risk data. climate risk management strategy, and internal accountability. In particular, entities are on their way to establish strong climate risk management and disclosure systems driven by TCFD guidances and increasing regulatory pressure. We can see they're also improving into setting up disclosure systems for portfolio financed emissions, although not all entities have full coverage of their financed emissions. Important also to note, if we look at the second and third bar chart here in this graph, that although increasing number of institutions, 70% are committing to increase the climate stewardship activities, only 14% have engaged without also opposing progress on climate legislation. So a lot more needs to be done on this specific response by financial institutions. So engagement with policymakers and clients and stakeholders. So what ultimately matters is the impact that financial institutions directly or indirectly have in the real economy. We can see that while direct investment in clean energy projects grew at an average rate of 6% per year, direct finance to fossil fuel plants also grew in the same period, reaching around 33 billion in 2023, and this resulted in clean energy investment level being slightly below financing to new fossil fuel projects, with a clean to fossil fuel ratio of 1:1. To give a comparator on a benchmark, BNF recommends a ratio of 4:1 by 2030 or 10:1 by 2050 in order to avoid the worst effect of climate change. So the ratio needs to change. We need to shift from funding fossil fuel to funding clean energy. Financial institutions also directly enable new clean energy and fossil fuel projects as shareholder owners or corporate lenders by providing capitals to companies that invest in such assets. We can see here that while 95% of overall direct financing observed for clean and fossil fuel projects came from banks, mainly in the forms of commercial debt at the project level, asset managers have a major role to play as they indirectly enable the vast majority or above 55% of such financing, mainly by lending money to institutions, corporates, and real economy actors that invested these assets. So in the graph on the right, banks are basically indicated with orange color, while asset managers are in the blue color. So this puts asset manager in the radar alongside with banks for their primary role in changing the financial system. So what have been the driving actions when we observe the data?
Valerio, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. So the first main driver has been that the target matters. We see that institutions with strong targets are more likely to follow on their goals, as shown in the graph on the right, which links targets response in the x-axis with implementation response in the y-axis. Second, large entities have generally adopted more developed targets and implementation responses, likely due to better resources and regulatory development targeting primarily large institutions. Third, regulatory development in Europe has been a key driver of transparency and progress for the financial sector in recent years. In particular, Nordic countries and the Netherlands have led the way in both target setting and implementation. And finally, institutions that are part of net zero coalitions were significantly more likely to adopt climate targets and implementation actions in 2023. There are some recommendations I have. I don't know if I have the time to go through all of them, but this was based on analysis we did with the net zero tracker data for pension funds. So first of all, it's important to bridge the gap between asset ownership and asset managers. The asset managers, we saw they have a massive impact in the deployment of capital to fund fossil fuel and renewable energy capacity, and the asset owner needs to provide voting guidelines, pulling together to increase pressure on asset managers to make sure that their practices are as aligned as possible with the net zero requirements. It is important to shift to realign passive investment funds in particular, because a lot of investment is shifting to passive investment. So it will be a key driver of change. It is important also, given the the really economic impact the asset manager have to also go beyond the owned assets and extending the assessment of asset manager to also include their own general investment philosophy, the overall sustainability practices, and the management of other assets. It is important to support access to financial structure to clean energy investment. We are going to hear about blended finance later on, so I'm not going to cover this aspect. And then finally, enhancement in portfolio emission data, climate finance taxonomy, and third-party validation targets are also needed to inform decision-making from capital allocators. And this is a key role that data providers can have in the coming years. So thank you very much. Sorry for being a little bit over in the presentation time.
That's great. Thank you so much. Valerio, quick question. How much percentage of the real economy portfolio is a net zero tracker following?
So at the moment, we calculate this. I think it's around 1/4 of the global financial system value. So it's around the 100 trillion of assets in the institutions that we covered. And some of the comparators we looked for, they were assessing the whole value of the global financial system in around 500 trillion. So it's roughly like 20%.
Okay, great. And you mentioned the finalized mitigation goals where financial institutions can reach Paris alignment. Where would this come from? Are this from the UNFCCC or we're expecting other signals to come from other processes?
Sorry, for what purpose?
For the finalized mitigation goals for financial institutions that you mentioned, that they were needed in order to...
Yeah, I think for the financial institutions, for mitigation goals, we're talking about greenhouse gas mitigation goals. At the moment, we're in a situation in which we have a variety of methodologies used to set up the goals and also to track how financial institutions are following on these goals. So one of the things which is needed is definitely the harmonization of the approaches to estimate emissions. This vary depending on the sector, but also depending on the assets that are covered by financial institutions, whether they are public equity, private equity, debt, sovereign debt. So there needs to be this is where the comment went in terms of we need to improve the data. And then and the coverage, and the other element is the validation. So the system is very much focused on self-reporting. So these emissions are self-reported. So to ensure the integrity of declared targets and emissions, third-party validation system will also be fundamental.
All right.
Thank you very much, Valerio.
Thank you.
All right. Now we are going to pass to our second speaker. And thank you so much for being here. Our second speaker of the day would be Adriana Vitagliano, which is a principal at Firstminute, where she spends most of her time across marketplaces, climate change policies, and deep tech. She joined Lakestar before this, and after completing a dual degree in Master of Science and Business at the University of Oxford, and previously worked as an investment partner at Creator Fund, focused on investing in deep tech and life science. What a nice nice mixture of topics, I would say, and University of Oxford AI spinout. She started her career at the PwC in New York City, and also served as the COO of the financial services steel vertical. Welcome, Adriana.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here with you. You can...
Thanks for having me.
And
perfect. Just see if I
looking
can...
forward for your presentation.
Thank you. Just want to make sure I can remote control these slides. Oh. I'm not sure if Fred is able to help with that, but maybe I can, in the meantime, just start with a quick intro that was great. But yeah, I'm Adriana. I'm an investor at Firstminute Capital. We're a London-based fund. We invest in lots of different technologies, including climate. And we invest anywhere from 250K to 5 mil in early stage companies across the EU, UK, and the US. Within the climate sphere, which is where I kind of co-lead our practice, we invested in lots of things, including AI software for predictive quality control in cement and concrete production, to cultivated meat, to tax credit marketplace for clean energy developers. So quite a wide range. And I'm here today to talk a bit on the theme of venture capital's role in financing climate innovation. Okay, I think we've got slides, amazing. In terms of agenda, I'm going to chat across a few topics. Some of these I'll speak to on a fairly basic level. So for those of you who are experts and might already know, bear with me. But so first, just in terms of addressing the massive scale of the climate crisis, obviously we don't need to get into what that means here, you all will know, but everything from carbon emissions, biodiversity loss, extreme weather, etc. This all requires significant investment in technology and in innovation. And while the scope of technologies contributing to addressing the climate innovation imperative is super wide, the barriers to scaling this innovation and scaling these technologies is also pretty considerable, including things like high upfront costs required to build and deploy some of these technologies, long development timelines, regulatory challenges, the list goes on. And so financial support, of course, is critical to kind of unpicking and overcoming these challenges. And this is where VC can come in and play a role in some cases.
Sorry, Adriana, could you slow down a little bit, please? I think our
Yes.
interpreters are having a hard time. Thank you so much.
Sure, no problem. And so in terms of what venture capital is, venture capital funds invest in very early stage companies. Lots of companies that we know and use, things like Uber, Airbnb, Meta, many more, were funded by venture capital funds. And what does a fund actually look like? It is essentially a pool of money that's been given by a set of investors to people like myself who are tasked with deploying that private capital into companies with the aim of generating financial return. Now, increasingly, we're seeing that this task of generating a financial return is paired more and more often with also contributing positively to the planet. And that is important to distinguish because for a while, these two goals were seen as potentially actually mutually exclusive. And again, kind of just going to the very basic level. So VCs will invest cash, will invest capital in exchange for equity or ownership of a company. So if I invest $1 million into a company that's building direct air capture and it's valued at 10 million, I then own 10% of that company. And in a world where this company ends up being worth $1 billion and my ownership stake has stayed the same, which would be unlikely, I've now turned my $1 million investment into 100 million, which is great news for my investors, 100x return. And this is kind of the incentive structure of VC, which I think is important to note in terms of how they operate. So lots of flavors of venture capital, different types of funds in terms of what stage. So you might have a company which is at its very earliest. You might have a founder or two. Maybe you have an idea, but no product, no revenue, really, really early stages. We call this pre-seed or seed funding. And so there are certain funds that will come in at this stage. And then you have folks that will come in much higher and they'll do multi-stage. So the point is, there's lots of different types of VC, but what makes it interesting and unique in the overall funding stack is that you have high risk tolerance. So you're used to taking pretty risky bets, long-term investment horizons. So often you're thinking that you won't be seeing your money back for 5 to 10 years. And then you're also focused as investors on how to help startups scale. So how to take something from 0 to 1, but then also maximize the impact in terms of how do we get this technology in the hands of as many people or companies as possible. And so in that sense, the venture capital funding can be quite well aligned with funding climate technology. Often we'll talk about the valley of death, which is when you have science-based ventures looking at how do you get your technology out of the lab and kind of scaled up beyond prototypes. Often there's a bit of a gap here around who's going to step in and fund that transition process. And sometimes, not all the time, but VCs can come in and play an important role here. And maybe just to mention some examples of good case studies where venture funding has played a role in helping climate startups succeed at scale are things like Tesla, of course, valued at almost $1 trillion today, Beyond Meat, backed by some really well-known Valley funds, including Kleiner Perkins, lots of others, Redwood Materials, backed by Bill Gates Fund, Breakthrough Energy, and more. But then maybe just to mention then, okay, great, interesting how climate might play, or how VC can play a role in climate. Where are we then today in 2023, 2024 phase? I think it's important to mention we're kind of in a second wave of venture funding for climate technology. So the first wave, which often people refer to as the clean tech boom, was 2003 to 2007 or 8, often referred to as a bit of a failure period, actually. So the clean tech bust, some people call it. And this is because in a lot of cases, there was a lot of venture dollars invested in R&D heavy or deep tech heavy ventures. And investors failed to see any money returned based on this. When I say that, I'm talking about technologies or products like biofuels, hardware, alternatives to silicon for solar panels, these sorts of things. And you had some winners, some companies that actually did quite well, but these tended to be in the software, the digital layer. And so after this phase, this first wave of venture capitalists investing in clean tech, there was a bit of scar tissue around, okay, if I invest in hardware, am I going to end up the same way as in the first clean tech bust? So even now, there's still a decent amount of funds and investors who say, I'm interested in investing in clean tech and climate tech, but I don't want to touch hardware. That is kind of another topic in its own right. But over the last 5 years, we've seen a huge resurgence, a lot more venture capital dollars flowing into climate deals. 2023, various numbers, but some estimate over $30 billion US dollars invested in climate ventures. In terms of how that ranks across other types of verticals that are receiving venture capital dollars, that came only second in comparison to AI, to artificial intelligence, which had a somewhat unprecedented hype year. So all that to say, the sector is alive and well. We'll get to investment trends, so like where those dollars are going in terms of types of companies later, but it is a promising outlook. And then maybe just to mention how venture capital is contextualized across the larger climate capital stack. So if you see this graphic I've got here, this comes from, by the way, an amazing resource called CTVC. Definitely check it out. And this just kind of shows how you have different types of players, different types of funders of climate tech. You have innovation at one end of the scale, deployment the other. Innovation being, look, again, we're super risky, we're super early. Deployment being, this technology has been de-risked and it's ready to be deployed. It's ready to be put into the hands of folks. And if you have VC at this kind of earliest stage with innovation, as an entrepreneur, and the reason I wanted to mention this is it's important to understand the different types of folks you'll need to pull in on the journey as the life cycle of your company progresses. And it's something that we as investors definitely spend time talking about. We want to feel confident that an entrepreneur, a founder, knows the types of capital within the stack and then when they might need to pull these people in. And it's an ever-growing map, and people are getting more and more creative in terms of how they can get involved here, which is a good thing. And now if we move into what does the climate tech VC ecosystem actually look like? So you have at the earliest stages, incubators and accelerators. So if I put myself in position, maybe some of you are thinking about starting a company, depending on how much is still unknown to you. Maybe you have a team, but not an idea. Maybe you have a great idea, but know that you really need to find an amazing co-founder to bring this idea to reality. There's different places you can go. Some people will raise money and start building. Some people will say, hey, it would be great to be part of a program, part of a cohort that is bringing together other folks who might also be interested in founding a company with me. And so that's what incubators and accelerators in some cases do. There are some names here. One I'll call out is Y Combinator. It's the most well-known accelerator. It's generalist, so it's not just focused on climate, but there is an increasing proportion of companies coming out of the Y Combinator cohorts that are climate focused. And then you have things like Carbon 13, for example, which is in several European cities, and I think going to the US soon, and will help kind of find a co-founder, and it's climate only. I guess just maybe one thing to mention again, if people are thinking about this, is that incubators and accelerators are often much more hands-on than normal venture funds. So they say, hey, we're going to give you some money to get started. We might also help you find a co-founder. We're going to give you strategy help. But as a result, they'll often take a much higher proportion of equity. So they might say, look, we're going to take 25% of your business, which is quite a lot. So it's just something to consider in terms of your motivations and desires as you go into company building, if you are. And then the kind of next phase is the venture fund landscape. And this is not the most helpful graphic, but shows the breadth of types of funds that are interested in funding climate ventures. I think just to note here is that you have a rising trend of funds that are raised with a mandate to only focus on climate in a way that you didn't 5 years ago. You then have generalist funds like the fund I work at, which are increasing their proportion of climate investments. And then you might have deep tech specialist funds or vertical specialist funds, which have a slightly sharper, more refined remit, which often will intersect quite nicely with certain climate verticals. So for example, you might have a prop tech specialist fund that's focused on investing in built environment that will naturally have a focus on companies doing EMS or decarb of commercial houses. And that is all to say that when we talk about who is getting involved and where they're putting the money, each fund and each type of fund will have different motivations and different mandates from their own investor base. Now moving into investment trends. So where is the money flowing? This is a view of the distribution of climate deals done between 2020 and 2023. Attempted segmentation based on verticals. So we have things from transport, like micromobility, to industrial, whether it's AI for mining or battery recycling, as you see with redwood materials. And this shows one kind of trend outlay, and it's changing. So if we talk about what 2024 is starting to shape up to look like, something like food and land use, for example, we're seeing less deals done there, and that's for a couple reasons. And we're seeing a lot more in pure energy, for example, as well as industrial. It's interesting, I've included some leaders in these spaces. It's hard to say like winners because it's still quite early. But some of these names, the reason they're here is they'll have, raised several $100 million worth of funding and be valued at quite high, couple $1 billion valuations. But again, that's not to say that it's a success necessarily. There's still, for example, someone like Climeworks in the direct air capture space out of Switzerland. They've built 2 or 3 factories and still have lots more to kind of grow into. So just a kind of caveat there. And then with this slide, just wanted to mention kind of if you put yourself in the shoes of an investor, how do you think about what's an attractive investment? And we use both a macro and a micro lens. On the macro side, you've got lots of really exciting tailwinds, things that cover the kind of like government sphere as well. So things like IRA in the US, the Horizons program, and we'll see lots of founders who choose where they want to build their company based on some of these government initiatives. Similarly, we think about talent. So you want to back a company that has the ability to hire the best people. And what's great is that we're seeing more and more of the best talent wanting to kind of dedicate their lives to working in climate. And there will be some arbitrage around that depending on where you are. On the counter to that, one of the things that makes it a bit difficult on the macro lens as an investor is climate is still so early, as just mentioned. So what does a blueprint for success look like? Whereas you have software businesses that may have been, 30, 40 years in the making, and you kind of can point to that as, okay, that's the blueprint and that's what we should follow as a company to become successful. Climate, in some cases, you have companies that are, 10 years old max. So still trying to unpick what that looks like and means. And then another point, which is around regulatory as well, but the politicization of climate. So I'm from the States. It's hard not to think about the upcoming election. We think very long and hard around certain business models become less or more interesting based on whether certain tax credits exist under the IRA or whether certain budgets have been cut as a result of who ends up in power. And then the last kind of piece we think about is how these companies are valued. And this is tied to the fact that in 2021, the market was really crazy, really frothy. And so you had a lot of exciting companies in the climate space valued at something that was a little bit detached from the progress they were at in terms of maturity. And so dealing with what that means in terms of consolidation and in terms of what's the likelihood of some of these companies actually surviving. And then if we move to the micro lens, so this is on a very tangible level, specific company, how capital intensive is it? How much money is going to be required to build hardware assets or to get a factory spun up? FOIC is a term we use to kind of signify first of its kind funding. So in some cases, you might have a technology that's never scaled up before. Who's going to come in and finance that first gigafactory, that first massive DAC factory? What can kind of be used to ameliorate this a bit is non-dilutive funding opportunities. And what this means is money that won't eat into your equity. So things like government grants. And that can help mediate concerns of investors around this first point on capital intensity. And then the last point, these two bullets are somewhat interrelated on innovation hype curve. So where on the hype curve does your technology sit in terms of readiness to be adopted? And the reason we think about that and care about that is because our time horizon is 5 to 10 years. So actually, if I move to the next slide, what that means is if we look at all these technologies plotted on this curve here, and green being we're quite close to plateauing in mainstream adoption, whereas a gray bullet represents, hey, look, this might still be 10 plus years away. For us, investing in something like nuclear fusion, if you see here, the gray dot on the left, is a lot trickier to make the case for than something like battery recycling in the green. So
Adriana, you have 2 minutes.
Perfect, right on time. So that's kind of hopefully like a bit of an overview. Again, some folks might know this stuff very deeply already, but just wanted to leave with a little bit more on us, but then also just the note that this space is increasingly vibrant. There's been more and more venture funding, more and more venture funds specifically dedicated to investing in climate technologies. And the space is just really in need of more brilliant entrepreneurs and committed investors. So I'll leave that with the group, and yeah, very happy to take questions at the end. But thanks so much. I made it a little ahead of time. Hopefully that's okay.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. It was a really interesting presentation, and yeah, made me think a lot about the different countries too. I mean, this seems like a very global North-led initiative, which could be a not so great news for a lot of our participants.
Totally. And the two largest contributors, by the way, are the US and China in terms of venture funding into climate technologies, with Europe kind of coming in third. But it's a great point. Yeah.
What do you think are those bottlenecks for Global South to unlock, a better cost of capital and so on to invest in this?
In some cases, it's just this gap, as mentioned, the financing gap, where you have a huge delta between early stage entrepreneurs thinking about, hey, there's this technology, maybe I'm familiar with it from university, but there isn't anyone who's willing to take on that high risk profile in the initial phases of a company. And so you see, I spent a little bit of time talking about this with folks thinking about spinning up an incubator accelerator program across the African continent. You have great business angels, which are single individuals who are interested in contributing their own capital, but then you don't have early stage funds. So as an entrepreneur, how are you supposed to survive 3-4 years without additional capital? Anyway, I'll pause there.
Well, thank you so much, Adriana. And I think we will move on to the next presenter, Omar.
Thank you.
Yeah. Omar Hernandez is a green investment specialist with extensive experience structuring blended finance instruments worldwide. He currently coordinates the US $1 billion green investment portfolio for the LAC regional office. He is the green investment coordinator for LAC GGGI. And yeah, his key flagship projects include $500 million mechanism for the American Flyway Initiative, $100 million green hydrogen project in the region, and multiple thematic bond structuration. He previously managed green investments and projects for IDEM Consulting and the Mexican Stock Exchange, strengthening the establishment of sustainable finance practices in the financial sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. Likewise, he worked at the British Impact Fund, Camco Clean Energy, which focused on investing in renewable energy projects in Africa. So yes, you've got 20 minutes and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm sharing my screen and you just confirm you can see it.
Yes. And sorry, just to our participants, if you have questions, please post your questions to the Q&A section, not in the general chat. But yes, sorry, please continue, Omar.
Yeah, no, sure. Okay, so as mentioned before, we want to focus on blended finance. Just to give you an introduction of what we do or where I work. I work at the Global Green Growth Institute. We are a trust advisor for governments and the private sector. We have around 88 offices worldwide. Our headquarters is in Seoul. And basically how we work is with donors and by providing from one side technical assistance for the structuration of investment projects, and from other side, it's bringing investors on board these projects. So we work as a, let's say, as a link, right, from the technical side, but also from the financial side. And so we focus, at least from the green investment perspective, in making the project happening. So that's just an introduction of GGI for all of you to know who you're talking with. So to start, what is relevant, or when we talk about climate finance, and what are the targets or the new targets that the new collective quantitative goals have set? As we know, in the last climate conference, it was agreed that the climate flows needs to go up to $1.55 trillion by 2030, not just in a specific sector. We just saw Valerio numbers, right, on the energy sector, but this means the $1.55 trillion needs to be in a cross-cutting area. So that means that we will need to be focusing in the three main aspects of when we are talking about climate. So loss and damage, adaptation, and mitigation. Right here, I won't stop in the numbers, but what is important to see on this snapshot is that in order to achieve all these investments of the 1.55 trillion in mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, it is important to have everyone on board. So this means not only public and development finance, but also private sector. So here, to achieving these targets, is important to start considering or start talking about blended finance. In a bit, we're gonna see what we understand of blended finance, but the role of blended finance to achieving these goals, it's basically critical, as it will leveraging the private climate finance by providing a clear signal of commitment and stability. So this means that to achieve these goals, we will need public and development finance to send a signal to private investors that this is doable and that the climate flows exist. So in order to make it able to, bring projects to, let's say, to reach financial close and to make them doable. So just also to you to consider when we are talking about blended finance is not just to achieving the goals, right? The goals of funding or the investments that we are thinking. It's also to understand what is the impact that we are facing right now or having right now due to the climate change. So here are some basic numbers. As of today, the climate change vulnerability trends are estimated that by 2050, the natural disaster bills, right, of the cost will be around $314 billion, right? And if we see, for example, that the population of the urban population will grow or will be 80% located in cities, this is basically showing us that we need to focus and invest in more resilient projects and in more strategic and greener and sustainable aspects. Again, just to give you some numbers that this is relevant, but because when we are talking about blended finance, right, we are talking about investments. We are talking about what an investor is looking for, but also what can we do to, to be more resilient and to adapt to climate change. So in terms of numbers, if we see the annual economic losses that currently all investors, right, and all public and private sector are facing, we can see that, the impact of extreme weather has gone in the last 23 years, has had an impact of 416 growth rate in terms of the costs they are facing because of the impacts of climate change. Also, when we are talking about extreme temperature, we can see a high increase of 254% cost or losses in dollars, in millions of dollars, when we are talking about creating and investing in projects. And this becomes relevant because when we are talking about creating and achieving the targets, we also need to consider how much is costing us already and what we can do to stop or to adapt to this, to this cost and to reduce the losses that we are facing. And just to go and to move to the blended finance aspect, just to give you also the snapshot, as we all know, the target is achieving 1.5 degrees, right, or below 2 degrees. Even when we are talking about this target and we consider that this temperature scenario against the GDP of the worldwide GDP, we can see that the cost already is gonna be that the GDP is gonna decrease 4.2% in the global economy. So this means, again, then we need to start thinking in how we can make more resilient our investment, how we can be more strategic, because if we are not also considering in blended finance in achieving the climate goals in more resilient and more strategic investments, we can then have a greater cost that could be up to 18%. And these numbers, in a nutshell, what I want to show you or tell you is that it's cheaper and it's more strategic to start thinking in being climate resilient and investing in climate aspects than not doing anything, and then the cost will be greater. So just to keep moving to blended finance, what do we understand for blended finance? Here there is not a common or there are several definitions, but all of them agree in one aspect, that it's the strategic, it's the best value money, right? So this means that being strategic in combining development funding. So this normally comes from public entities or development banks, right? That when we talk about development funding, we talk about concessional funding. So this means cheaper fundings, right? So no interest rates or lower interest rates that commercial, like market rates, commercial aspects. So blended finance is combining the concessional funding to leverage or to bring private capital to make a project or initiative bankable. So how does this work is by you bringing, or by the project bringing concessional capital, it's sending a message to the private sector saying that because you already have a percentage of the required investment, you will be able to bring private capital or venture capital, as we were seeing, to the table to make the project bankable. So when we are talking about blended finance, there are several archetypes that exist. I'm going to show the most common and the example structures that are more common worldwide. We want to see in a bit specific cases, but so we can see that the most common is grants. So basically the grants are used to provide technical assistance or to cover the cost of of pre-feasibility and feasibility studies to make a project or initiative bankable. But we also have some aspects as guarantees. So blended finance is with a guarantee, what you are able to do is to provide a payment, right, or a political guarantee that it's saying or providing the opportunity to say, okay, private sector, right, or investor, what I'm gonna do is to give you a guarantee if the project developer or whoever is implementing the initiative is not or will not pay or will go to a default risk, I will assume that risk. And so by doing so, by providing the guarantee, it is able and possible to bring new solutions to the market. I won't stop here, but because we're gonna see there in a bit. So also, why does blended finance matter, right? We already saw some of the venture capital, investment goals and interest, but what are the main barriers as of today for investors to not look or to not having an exponential growth in projects and unsustainable projects? The first one is the liquidity risk, right? Now, what an investor is looking for, it's they look for investment that have a secure return, that they can guarantee that the commitments will be paid on time, and that's hard to prove when we are talking about new climate and new solutions that are not the common ones, like energy, right, or agricultural aspects. Here we're talking about more innovative solutions that are coming to market. Also, macroeconomic risks. Here we are talking about low growth market rates, lack of transparency, regulatory aspects, and so on. Something that now investors are looking for, it's for climate disclosure aspects. So in more of the south cone or developing economies, the climate disclosure, it's just being integrated. So this means there are markets that still need to grow in terms of providing information on greenhouse gas mitigation, greenhouse gas emissions, right, impacts, and so on. Another aspect is the currency risk, which basically means that most of the investments that are made in developing countries needs to be paid in local currency. So this exposure or these expose investors to exchange rate fluctuation, right? And here, for instance, if we have a reputational risk or a change of government or a change of regulation, this might affect how your revenue or as an investor will face the development of these projects in the country. And so finally, climate risk, because as of today, as I was showing at the beginning, we don't have specific data on how the vulnerability will affect the assets. This will have a direct impact on how the losses, right, or how profitable the project will work. In terms of how blended finance brings solution to these barriers, one, it's through debt financing. Through blended finance, it is possible to provide de-risking instruments. So basically, this is providing the investors a positive cash flow, for instance, to say in terms of liquidity risk, right? Whether if it's a guarantee or not. It can also provide grants. As I was saying, some of the main barriers is that most of the projects also, they don't have some technical or pre-feasibility studies, from the vulnerability risk, from, other aspects, because they don't have the money. So grants provide them the possibility to, cover the remaining or the lack of some studies. So then they can reach financial close and they can be more attractive for investors. And finally, it is also possible to offer something that is called first loss capital, which basically means providing a a capital it's called loss protection. So you provide capital, and basically what you are telling the investors is, if something goes wrong, right? If the project is not going well, the first loss is going to be taken by us. So by the developing agency. So it's basically saying you won't lose the money. The money that will be on risk first is our money. So you can invest and be more secure. So this covers, for instance, the liquidity risk or even the macroeconomic risk in some aspects. In terms of the main actors, and because of time, I'm just gonna show some examples. When we are talking about multilateral development banks and development financial institutions, we're talking about the big ones, right? World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and so on. When we are talking about public sector, we're talking about national governments that that they are the ones that are normally advocating to achieve their development cooperation agenda and the sustainable development goals and so on. Then we have investors. Here it's a wide variety, but we already saw some examples. So here I'm just showing BlackRock and other that are the main big firms leading the market. And finally, we have also philanthropic donors that some of, when we are talking about climate, we have Bloomberg Philanthropies, we have Bill and Melinda Gates, but what they are doing in terms of providing capital, it's providing, let's see here, they are willing to provide they have a bigger risk tolerance in terms of funding projects than institutional investors. So this graphic, what I want to show you in terms of blended finance is how investors behave in terms of developing or adapting to projects. So here, for instance, we can see that philanthropic public donors, they are well adaptive in risk tolerance. So they are open to fund new solutions or projects that are not ready to be in the market, right? Whereas institutional investors or private commercial investors, they have a low tolerance in terms of investing in projects that are not proven, right? But they have the capital. So why is important blended finance? You want to see here something called the valley of the dead, which basically means this is the stage where most of the projects or initiatives hesitate or have problems in being implemented. So blended finance allows to bring all these, let's say, all these actors to the cash flow positive trend. So which means is through the philanthropic public donors and multilateral development funding, you will cover all these risk by providing concessional capital, by making them attractive to the market. And so once you support them in this implementation, then you will be able to have a profitable or let's say rentable projects that will be financed through these investors. So that's how blended finance work. I want to use my last 5 minutes showing you a specific case. I think it's better to see how it works in real life. So let's see technical assistance facilities, which is one of the most common aspects in blended finance. I want to go and show you the Global Sustainability Climate Fund, which is a 50 million fund dedicated to finance infrastructure and nature-based solution projects, right? This fund has a specific window of 28 million in technical assistance facility. And how does this work and how basically blended finance works is this way. So because one of the biggest challenges on having climate finance projects is we don't have pipeline development, and we don't have projects or companies that are focused on on specific areas and on specific sectors. This fund first seeks to build a pipeline development of climate smart infrastructure and nature-based solution projects. And how they do this, it's by providing 3 main supports that will make them bankable. First, they establish a project preparation facility that aims to providing the specific intervention to make them bankable. So this means, I'm sorry if I'm being, quite technical, but so this means seek for the project or the companies right, from the origination, provide funding. So concessional funding, most of this is in terms of grants. So let's say free or, you know, in a concessional basis. So they pay for the feasibility projects. They support the structuration of the project. So this is basically making them ready for the roadshow, right? The financial requirements, the legal requirements. And they also, normally a project preparation facility will support in the transaction support. So this means the global subnational climate funds will also support each project or company in a way that they can present or they can reach investors to make these projects to happen. But they also bring something in terms of capacity building. So blended finance is not only focused on making, you know, or bringing the best value of money in terms of dollars, but it's also creating and establishing new ways of capacity in the countries. So basically, they provide technical workshops, they promote best practices, and they provide trainings to public sector, to private sector, to local developers and local companies to understand how to bring this mix of public and private funds and how to make projects and an initiative or companies doable. And finally, something that is really important in terms of when we are talking about the climate agenda, it's having a clear understanding on the monitoring, reporting, and verification of indicators, right? So here what we are saying is that blended finance also allows, and honestly, I will say it requires to provide data, right? Data that we were seeing, for instance, with Valerio, right? So what are your impact metrics? How much emissions have you, have you produced or have you mitigated? How many social or gender interventions have you and so on. I think I'm almost over time, so I'm gonna go just to give you another example. Here I won't be able to go, but I wanna show you another innovative way in terms of blended finance. It's, for instance, in Galapagos, in Ecuador, one of the biggest challenge in terms of blended finance was the political risk and the default risk that the country is facing. This means that Ecuador is facing a default high risk, which is basically they are likely not to be able to pay their debt to, the donor, to their investors. So here through blended finance, it was possible to provide what is called a guarantee in terms of a political risk guarantee that is basically saying if the government is not able to pay, the debt of the bonds or the debt that they have with investors, we will pay you that debt. And thanks to this blended finance structure of, in this case, to this political risk guarantee, it was able to create one of the biggest transactions in terms of conservation in the world, which was basically establishing a $450 million fund for the conservation. And well, I'm just gonna finish with this with this mathematical operation that I liked, which is basically showing that the difference between doing nothing, right, and doing something. So if we don't do anything, or we just keep saying, let's go in the same path, we won't get the result. But we start doing a minimum, a minimum change every day, we are able to have we have a consistent effort, we will be able to start achieving more positive and more results. And in terms of respect the time, that will be my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you
Thank you so much.
Hey, friends, we are a little bit out of time. So we kindly invite the panelists to please help us respond the questions in the button. So you right next to your share button, you can find the questions and answers, and we can answer those questions as we continue with the last segment, which we want to invite Adele to come to the podium, the virtual podium. Well, we want to have a little conversation. Hello, Adele. Well, just to briefly introduce you, Adele Ramdani studied political science and international relations and human rights in several universities across 3 continents, and worked on several international organizations, including the Capital Development Fund of the UN, the African Union, and the League Arab States. And well, you received scholarships and work with the International University of Barat when you decided to dedicate his work on sustainable food production. In Brussels, he created and launched the United Nations series in cooperation with Washington, D.C. And is, oh my God, so many things, Adele. Well, maybe you can pick the ones that are the best, but the fact is that you are a very well youth expert. We can say we admire you a lot in the space, and we're happy to have this conversation with you today. How are you doing, Adele?
I'm good. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. Always great to talk to you.
Yeah, great. So I wanted to talk about philanthropy financed here today with you, because it's a topic that it's missing from all the conversations that we're having today. That is very linked to what Omar was saying about the risk portfolio and those projects that are needed on ground, but don't usually have financial inclusion enough to be able to operate. And youth-led initiatives and climate justice initiatives are one of those cases. So what can you tell us about the barriers and the opportunities on this sector?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I'm happy actually with the flow of the conversation because Omar was talking about philanthropic entities, right before ending his presentation. So I really want to also talk about that and speak a bit about access to funding, right, for youth-led organizations, which is quite a known challenge for many of those organizations. Again, what's interesting for me is that when we talk about funding those conversations, it's always kind of a dry conversation, right? We speak about money as if it's a neutral topic. And I think what we're really missing in those conversations is to talk about power and about justice, right? Because at the end of the day, this is what money is about. Money is not just something that happens. Money is something which can be used and is being used to very often impose a certain agenda, impose a certain narrative. And it's not just by any chance that certain groups are getting tons of funding while others are just not. So what we try to do in my organization, and luckily we're not the only ones, is really to work with youth-led organizations or indigenous-led groups or women-led groups to enable them to develop their own narrative, to move away from the mindset of scarcity towards a mindset of abundance, and understand that at the end of the day, when we talk about finance or the charity sector, what we're truly talking about is addressing decades and centuries of oppression, right? So what we're trying to do is really to kind of use money in order to heal, as opposed to using money in order to divide people. And the big issue I see is that most of the funding that we've been talking about so far is big funding, right? Big envelopes that never end up in the hands of local groups, indigenous groups, or youth-led organizations, right? The reason for that for me is there's two reasons, right? One is that those organizations are very, very small, right? And so they don't have the capacity to absorb such large grants, right? So what we see in the field is that a huge bank, development organization will make a grant to a Global North NGO, which has hundreds of staff, headquarters in London and DC or Brussels, right? And then those are the ones that will be implementing the projects in the Global South, right? So we have to change that. And one of the ways of doing that is really to kind of enable the building regional funds, right? Where the issues are taking place. And this is how you start addressing issues of justice, right? By ensuring that the money goes through first through intermediaries, that are in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Then those guys who understand the ecosystem in which we work will be redistributing the funds, right, towards smaller organizations. And then the second reason I believe why such organizations are historically, chronically underfunded is because the very nature of their work is about addressing power, right? Their agenda, their mandate are not market driven. It's not about making money, right? It's about moving away from an extractive system towards a healing system. And this is really hard to justify that to a venture capital because the nature of the work is just different, right? It's about how do we work with indigenous group in terms of reclaiming their lands, in terms of moving away from fossil fuels and towards like more localized ways of producing energy. It's about reviving food systems using agroecology, permaculture, traditional knowledge, as opposed to industrial farming, right? So all those solutions cannot be bankable or scalable because they just don't meet the criteria of the market. So maybe let me stop for here for now and see if you have maybe any follow-up questions.
No, but that's super great. But do you have any ideas on how can we address these barriers in a systemic level as well? Because you mentioned the regional funds as being part of, but maybe you have any other.
Exactly. So there's quite a few funds that already exist, right? I mean, for the youth, obviously, we know the Youth Climate Justice Fund, which does this work of kind of, empowering and funding youth-led organizations. The Climate Resilience Fund also exists, who aims at really sort of addressing, power issues. So those things do exist. What I also encourage usually young people to do is to kind of really work collaboratively, right? So as opposed to submitting one project per grant, what about we have a group of NGOs kind of working together towards a common agenda, and then you can reach out to the big funders. I think we also have to be very, very more assertive as young people looking for funding, understanding that this is something which is due as opposed to something which, we should be just thankful for. And I think local philanthropy can also play a huge role, right? So we usually go for the main, the usual suspects when it comes to philanthropy. A few foundations were named in that conversation, but I think there's also immense momentum to actually leverage on local philanthropy, right? So we do see the rise of those stakeholders at the local and regional level. I think something that we should also be very mindful of is, we have a mindset, in the nonprofit sector of not, how to say, not how you use our time effectively. We're often very okay with not being paid or being underpaid or volunteering, right? So we have to find some ways to move away from just a volunteer mindset and start really billing our time for the work that we do, right? And that also tracks back to the issue of reporting. When we have to report on the projects, we should be asking for more flexible funds, less report, more trust-based philanthropy. And we should be hearing those voices going directly from the youth as well, not just from philanthropy.
Yeah, I want to wrap up then with some recommendations maybe that you can give to these youth organizations that are watching as well on how to climb that ladder in the sense of getting those enabling conditions that they might need in order to unlock better sources of funding to sustain their operations.
Yeah, I think the first one is really to be truly transformative and innovative in our ideas, right? I think many, including mine, like youth-led organizations, we are so used to thinking small because of lack of funding that even when funding is available, we struggle to come up with truly systemic level kind of solutions, right? So I think we have really to kind of work on ourselves about how do you define a vision, a strategy which is big and bold as opposed to simply something which could be funding or could be funded, right? I think the second thing is to do a lot of work around mapping. We tend to focus on the same people and then we miss key collaborations, with what's going on right now, right? So we tend to repeat what's being done already. We tend to repeat what others are doing. Where I don't think we need more NGOs, right? We just need more collaboration. We need more bridges, right? And then on the purely fundraising side, I think many NGOs usually tend to forget something very simple, which is that they need to be registered. They need to be legally registered in order to receive funds, right? So it happens quite often that we are unable to fund particular organizations because they don't have a bank account or they don't have they're not legally registered. and then they run into issues when it comes to finding a fiscal sponsor, right? So also encourage young people with organizations to really look into that, not to forget that if you're not legally registered, you should definitely be on the lookout for a fiscal sponsor. Thanks again.
Well, we thank you so much for your time, and I wish we could have a further session for more discussions, because this is definitely a topic that is interesting for all of us. So Adele, thank you again, and thank you to all the speakers, and we wish that that we can repeat this occasion in the future. Kenta?
Yeah. So if anyone has one very, very quick question, I think we can take it. But is there anything absolutely emergent that we want to ask? Okay, well then we will try to make it so that the answers that were answered in the Zoom session can be distributed to the people who are watching the sessions online, maybe through comments on YouTube or something. But I think we will wrap up the session. A few groundkeeping sort of things. Just wanted to let you know, for those who answer the quizzes, thank you very much. We got a lot of answers, and it was great to have all of you completing the quizzes. For those who could not submit the quiz, we will try to come up with some ways for you to be able to get the certificate for the program even without it. At the very end, we will not be saying anything about it at this point, so please do follow along. You will still have a chance to get the certificate. You will not be losing out completely. But for more information, please do give us a little bit of time to formalize what specifically we will be assigning you to do in order to complete the program and to get your certificate. And yes, I think that is about it. Jen, do you know when our next session is?
No, I think it should be around. Let me check on the calendar.
I think it's the 1st of October 1st. Yes.
October 1st. Yes.
And we're so excited to see you all there.
All right. So yes, we will see you on the 1st of October. Thank you so much for joining us in our last session of September.
You can always reach out to us in our social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube.